everyone, and welcome to today's session here at Purple Hats. I'm super excited to have you here with us because we have really three of the smartest people in cybersecurity that I've had the privilege of working with in my career, and I do mean that. And they're smart on their own, but they're especially smart because they become leaders in the practice of threat-informed defense and the adoption of MITRE ATT&CK, which is so cool. So let me introduce them to you. First of all, Madeline Carmichael, Senior Threat Intelligence Librarian at Microsoft. Hey, Madeline.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us. Madeline's joining from the UK, so it's much later there than it is here in Oakland, California. And we have Iman Ghanizadeh, who oversees Google's Security Operations Center Transformation Solution, which is called the Autonomic Security Operations. Hey, Iman.
Hey, great to see you.
And we have James Stanley at CISA, who's the Chief of Product Development, which, as I'm thinking about it, amongst the four of us, that's probably the coolest title, Chief of Product Development. So, James, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
MITRE ATT&CK was published in 2015, and since that time, it's had a transformative impact on the industry. And these three folks, all in their own way, are leveraging MITRE ATT&CK and using it to improve our cyber defense position and to improve the cyber defense of key data and assets all over the world. So today I want to start with James because he is the one who really writes and leads the coordination and drafting of a lot of the CISA alerts, which include MITRE ATT&CK in them. So James, could you tell us a little bit about sort of the origin of the CISA alert process and how and when it started using MITRE ATT&CK within it and why?
Yeah, so I think that's a pretty deep and complex question, but I think to kind of hit the surface of that, this is something that we've been doing for consistently about 3 years now, 3 or 4 years, and before that, CISA or the previous name or organization that we fell under, we were still writing reports and we were still talking about threat actors and what they were doing. But it really took a life of its own organically in the last 3 years. And part of that was as I was working at CISA as a network analyst and I was writing emerging threat advisories for the federal community, a lot of that was based on broad data and broad network analysis. And it was heavily focused on what we were seeing as far as unique indicators. And the community appreciated that and a quick turn if something was happening in that day or week. But one of the consistent feedback mechanisms that we were getting from the federal community was that they wanted to know the exact behaviors behind the threat actors doing this activity. And we didn't have the answer to that. And so that's when I started personally leaning on MITRE ATT&CK and understanding that this is the universal framework for discussing the threat actor behavior. And leaning more towards a proactive defense rather than reactive defense. And so that's when my team essentially started taking MITRE ATT&CK, the framework, and implementing it into every product we write as long as it's applicable, which is essentially all of the products that we write when it comes to operational defensive products. So that was, again, about 3 years ago. And at this point, we've adopted it, I think, as a unified U.S. government voice that anytime we write something about a threat actor, we will include indicators as applicable, but we are going to include MITRE ATT&CK as the core piece of the product.
That's awesome. And can you talk a little bit about how agencies and the intelligence community contribute? Is it more of a push, like you're asking them to supply stuff about MITRE ATT&CK, or have they learned at this point to send it? And is it a natural thing? Like, how does this happen?
The exciting thing, I think, is when we first started doing it, it was more of a push. I think it was something that others hadn't adopted yet. It's relatively new. As you said, it started in 2015, which for our community is relatively new. But in the recent year or two, I think it's universal across the board. We work a lot with all of our U.S. government partners. We work with our international partners, and we also work a lot with private industry. And I see essentially everyone across the board implementing and leaning on this framework as much as possible.
That's awesome. So, Madeline, you're operating in this Cyber Threat Intelligence Center here at Microsoft, and you have a global network of infrastructure and customers and users all over the world that are engaging information. How have you found ATT&CK to be helpful to customers or end users as a platform of communication?
Yeah, it's the benefit of it is huge, and like James said, it's basically the de facto framework of choice across the cybersecurity industry these days, whether you're a vendor or a customer or a government. It's something that I think customers are looking for in all types of products, whether that's just informational research or the alerts and like the actual security products that they're looking at. And yeah, the benefit there is just being able to say one thing and have that follow the information through. So an indicator, labeling it with an attack technique like data encrypted for impact, where it's ransomware focused, and having that follow that indicator through to an alert for a customer really brings their focus onto that as a high priority alert to action. But similarly, they can then go from that and say, okay, I have seen this alert tagged with whatever technique it has on it, and they can then do onward research across all vendors, government, like any other data that they want to look into to expand their knowledge of that threat based on the behavior as opposed to the indicator.
That's awesome. And can you give us a little bit of a picture of how Microsoft uses it in communicating outwardly to customers? How does that process work?
Yeah, so it's something that is becoming a lot more common across all of the areas of Microsoft that I personally have visibility into. So it's something my team is using in the Microsoft threat intelligence space. It's something that products are using with alerts, like I mentioned. It goes into our long form reporting as a way to kind of contextualize certain procedural examples that we've included in the report. So we will add an appendix at the end that kind of says we've referred to this elsewhere in this report and it matches this technique, similar to what the CISA alert content looks like with the appendix there. Yeah, and it's just, I think it's something that customers are starting to expect, and it helps standardize across all of the different ways they're trying to protect their networks and their estate. Having that same vocabulary across all of those products and communications and reports and whatnot, it's a good key to kind of use across all of those data sources.
That's awesome. And since you're a librarian, I can't help but be reminded of the Dewey Decimal System and draw an analogy between attack and that system.
Yes, they are very
Yeah.
similar.
Yeah, that's awesome. And hopefully it will continue to be that adopted so that elementary school children across the country and around the world think about threats that way. Well, I'm just kidding. Iman, tell us a little bit about your perception of attacks adoption from your seat. How have you seen it change the world and make a difference for defenders?
Great question. Okay, so before I answer that, are any of you guys gamers? Any of you? Has anyone played a single story, single player game end to end?
Yeah.
Okay.
Of course.
So anyways,
Yes.
sometimes, you'll be playing a video game and there's these things called side quests. Okay. And so the main quest may be here and suddenly the side quest comes up and it's like, if the main quest is defending the universe, the side quest comes up and it's like, but collect 50,000 jellyfish to now protect the town of whatever. The main story of the theme here is AttackIQ and sorry, MITRE ATT&CK and everything else. But I'm always going to throw in a couple side quests here. And I was just thinking about taking that joke earlier one step further, that Google, Microsoft, and DHS walk into a bar and AttackIQ is the bartender and they have to play Squid Games. Who survives and why? And you don't have to answer it here because it can get very controversial. But I want everyone in the audience to think about this for a second. Okay. Okay. No, sorry.
I think we should do a whole separate section of Purple Hats where we do that. We might have to do it live and just set a camera up and record it.
Okay. No, back to MITRE ATT&CK. So on the attack front, a couple thoughts here. So one is, earlier before we were, on this session, we were chatting a little bit and we were talking about, I was talking about rehabbing a property, and I was thinking about MITRE ATT&CK. At the same time, I was also thinking about like ISO standards, because ISO standards for many things, electricians, for home engineering, for construction, for, there's standards for pretty much everything. they're such a critical part of of our world. They're why our homes are designed the way they are. They're basically a common understanding that we have come together worldwide with, I think, over 50 countries to determine, basically the minimum acceptable criteria for different things, different use cases, home development, construction, IT, networking, everything in between. But anyways, the reason I say that is because if it wasn't for ISO standards, there would be a lot of issues, with construction in homes, and we've seen the failure of standards happen in places all over the world. We've seen the failure of standards lead to really devastating outcomes for people. An example of that is the latest earthquakes that had impacted Turkey, which were absolutely devastating to dozens of thousands of people directly and probably millions of people indirectly. It was a terrible incident. And one of the things that I realized is a lot of the buildings that were, if you take like the environment, right? You have an environment, you have an asset, and the asset is you or the buildings, right? And the threat is the earthquake, right? I mean, it's the same thing in cybersecurity, right? You have a threat times the vulnerability times the asset. Without the three, there's no risk. You take the lack of standards or foregoing standards, and it can lead to disastrous outcomes that can impact people's lives. And in the context of our lives in technology, we kind of have the same need for a common criterion, a common understanding of the adversary. Because at the end of the day, cybersecurity is pretty much like a kind of good versus evil game, right? And every vendor has their own way of doing things, and a lot of security engineering teams are bespoke, solving things in different ways than other teams. But MITRE ATT&CK is really powerful because it puts into perspective an adversary's tactics, techniques, and procedures, and still has much more development of, maybe the vertical growth of these TTPs and, the horizontal scale of the types of TTPs that it encapsulates. But over time, I think as more and more of us across the industry, Google, Microsoft, all the folks, practitioners worldwide, CISA, as we start to iterate, improve, and also operationalize attack across solutions, across frameworks, across process, it really puts us at a place where we're all kind of communicating in the same language when it comes to building better cybersecurity defenses. So in my opinion, I think attack is a great thing for the industry. And I think has a lot more potential that is years to come. That'll only happen through the continued participation of the entire industry to help advance it and make it more accessible to, businesses around the world.
That's awesome. I mean, thank you for telling us, first of all, that joke, which is really the best. Thank you for that. I didn't know that was what we woke up today needing, but here it is. We needed it. As you were talking, and I don't want to put everyone on the spot, but I'm going to put everyone on the spot. The Biden administration just came out with this new national cybersecurity strategy, which I thought was really cool for a number of reasons. One of which is that it makes an argument, which previous strategies before were like, cyber's a big problem, like do something about it. Here's what we're going to do. Here's our laundry list. But this one actually came out and said, there's an economic problem underpinning cybersecurity. That problem is that companies aren't, I don't want to put Google and Microsoft on the spot, but the problem is that companies aren't making the necessary investments in order to be secure. So therefore, we need to set a mandate for regulation. And then they come out and say we're going to update all of our regulations, which obviously is like a work in progress for them. But one of the things that they said in light of when you were talking made me think of on page 8, it said regulations should be performance based, right? It's like you can set a regulation, but if you can't measure how well you're actually doing at meeting that regulation, then you're just simply setting a regulation. And people are going to sort of wave their hands in the air and say, how do I prove that I'm doing this? But if we have MITRE ATT&CK at the center, you can actually prove that you're meeting a certain kind of regulation because you can run assessments against it, or you're using the Dewey Decimal System to prove your overall health. What do you guys think of that?
I think Dewey Decimal, Melville Dewey would be very surprised to hear his name used in that context.
Yeah. Yeah, Melville Dewey gets a new lease on life in terms of cybersecurity effectiveness. But I mean, look, this is what CISA is alerting the world when something happens to say, get yourself ready. These are the alerts. I mean, when SolarWinds came out and that alert came out, that was my first thought. It was like, test yourself using attack, right?
Yeah, so I think some of the interesting stuff. I mean, broadly speaking, about um, CISA alerts. Um, we all know that one of the big wow, okay, there's a footprint on my wall. I don't know how it got there, but it's like way above normal standard height, and I just
Is it a
sorry.
squirrel footprint?
This is another side quest. Okay,
Figure
no,
out how the
let's get
footprint
back.
got there.
Yeah, let's get back to CISA alerts. So one of the things that I know a lot of times, so we, obviously we're both a security vendor. Google plays ball in so many different basketball courts. We have a security business that provides commercial security capabilities to customers. We have consulting businesses that help advise customers on best practices. We supply customers with cloud platforms where they can build and modernize their businesses. We also have services like Gmail and YouTube and all sorts of things around the world that people consume and leverage. And then at the same time, we also have research teams internally across Google, across our various different businesses, across folks that actually have to turn this research into something actionable that our products can consume, that our end users can take advantage of. So many different facets that attack has some type of relevance across the organization. And like your mileage may vary. What I mean by that is it is up to the teams to figure out how they can best take advantage of this framework so that they can benefit directly, indirectly, and their end users can benefit from it. But the one thing going back to the idea of, some of the topics around CISA alerts, one of the key things I notice around threat intelligence and around a lot of the research that's produced in the field is it's really hard to consume unstructured data. And so over the past couple of years, I know that CISA has been refining their delivery of a lot of the research that they're performing, because it's not just having high quality research of their adversaries, it's making it actionable and also providing it in a timely manner and also making it relevant to the industries. Because if we put out a bulletin about some big supply chain, attack going on across, affecting a couple industries, sorry, just broadly speaking, it's going to be really hard for me as a consumer of that knowledge to be able to take that data and turn it into something that's actionable for me. So what I've seen over the course of the past couple of years is CIS has been refining, and James, you could probably tell us a little bit more about this, but they've been refining the quality, the delivery, the basically the ability to make things actionable, so that whether I'm a vendor, whether I'm a consumer, whether I'm a security engineering team, the content that I see is something that I can immediately take advantage of and leverage and drive action towards. But James, kind of curious to hear some of your thoughts about how you all have been refining, your learning process.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you touched on is exactly what we're trying to do. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think, leveraging attack, and I want to focus on that because it's the bread and butter of not only this conversation, but really what we do and what we lean on. But that's getting us to a better place quickly. For all the different reasons we've already discussed, because it's a unified language across the entire community, because it's quicker, it's more actionable. But when you talk about us refining our alerts and advisories, I think that is one of the keys. And I'll just kind of read off. I found this piece of feedback on one of our alerts based on a ransomware group. And it was from a director of Intel at an unspecified organization. And they basically said, MITRE ATT&CK mappings, whether it's in CISA alerts or otherwise, but this example was in one of our alerts. It makes it really easy to identify detection rules. So they included one example where pivoting on modified registry techniques and disable antivirus, disable anti-spyware listed in the reports table took them directly to an existing rule in the public Sigma repository to recognize the exact activity and get a quick security win. So again, like pivoting off of just chasing around old, stale IP addresses, hashes, things like that, and giving this organization who might not be impacted at all, but essentially will be at some point, right? It's not really whether it's not an if, it's a when at this point in our world in cyber. They were able to take that, and someone somewhere in their organization, I would assume a low level, maybe tier 1, tier 2 SOC analyst in the middle of the night, was able to implement a quick actionable win based on a report, and that was all based on mapping to attack.
That's an immensely powerful outcome. What, James, in your conversations with industry, what are some of the other pieces of feedback that you've heard? Are folks celebrating MITRE ATT&CK? Is it just, are folks too busy to read the alerts? Like how's the industry responded to what you're trying to do?
I think overall it's generally positive. I think there are pieces that we can work towards, and there's pieces, very specific feedback coming in that, this isn't right now. We're putting our reports out and it's posted on our website, it's posted in a PDF, but what can we do to better make that, automated ingestion for the organizations, essentially, so they don't really have to do much, if anything, with it, right? They just bring it on and it's ingested into their system. So I think, we're getting there. We can probably do better. That's outside of attack in this conversation, but there's always room for growth, and especially something this new, this unique. I think when we say new, I don't think it's unique to CISA. I think this is new for the community. It wasn't long ago. It was probably less than 10 years ago. We were afraid to talk about things when it happened to us, and we still sort of are today. Meanwhile, the adversary is the opposite. They love talking about it, and they love sharing their ideas and how they do things, and that's part of why that makes them so successful. So I think we're all kind of catching up to that, and I think, again, just focusing on the unified language to talk about it makes it a lot easier. And then the other piece of feedback that I will get from folks, specific to attack and the framework, is that it's not all encompassing. There are times where they see a unique tactic or technique used by an adversary that's not in the framework. Um, and it's obviously growing. I'm not going to speak for MITRE. We do work closely with them. I know that they ingest that feedback and they grow the attack framework. But I will say, my sort of pushback is it is the most comprehensive we have out there right now. So that's some of the negative feedback that we listen to. We want to hear it. We want to hear more. I think no feedback is negative. It's just pushing us towards progress.
Yeah. Whenever somebody doesn't answer my request for reading a paper, usually that means it's junk. So now I want to pivot to global alliances and partnerships, because Madeline, you're based in the UK, and Iman, you just got back from a trip to the Middle East. And James, you work also with our allies and partners in coordinating these alerts. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about how are we seeing non-US countries, non-US governments or allied governments adopt attack, and how are we seeing our partners in companies around the world who are not based in around the same exact lexicon necessarily from the beginning adopting attack? Do you have any thoughts on that, anyone?
I mean, I'll say from a CISA perspective, we work with our Five I, our usual five partners. So that's us, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK. And I think it was really, I mean, I'm not going to say that CISA was the first to arrive here, but as you can see, if you go and check out, when Australia publishes something on threat actor behavior activity that's emerging, sort of like CISA does, you're going to see that it's mapped, maybe not exactly like we do, but there's always going to be some sort of attack table in somewhere in their reports. And I think across the board, we're seeing that more and more with our closest international partners, and we're seeing that with other international partners that we have relationships with, as well as outside of the government. I just think, Madeline and Iman can talk better than I can, but I see, non-American based companies that we're all kind of doing the same thing, I think, at this point.
Interestingly enough,
sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Madeline. No, go ahead.
On the partnerships angle, though, attack does help, I guess, overcome any sensitivities in sharing indicators or things like that. So it does enable us a sort of middle ground for sharing with partners that without it as a tool, we might not be able to share as quickly on some things.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, Iman, go ahead.
No, well, I got another side quest here, but I'll save it for after this topic. I actually just figured out why there's a shoe print on the wall. And yesterday, my spouse sent me a text message with this insect on the wall, and I just put two and two together. I was like, oh, okay, that's what happened.
Should she kick the insect? She
I
threw a
imagine
shoe at
she
the insect on the wall?
probably shoe through it. You know, it was nice it was the insect and not me, okay? Because usually it's me, but
This is a great example of non indicator of compromise based analysis. Like, the tactic and technique and procedure being used to conduct an attack, which is the shoe. So
yeah. You know, every time I listen to a webinar, I'm always like, I want to laugh, and sometimes they're too serious. So I hope that anyone listening to this has a little bit of fun along the way. And if you want, just follow us on Twitter, and we'll probably have more of these stories, in our personal feeds.
Yeah, I really appreciate the side quests and the reference to gaming. I'm not a gamer, but my wife is. So now I have a reason to tell her to listen, because otherwise she would this is all gibberish to her. So thank you for that.
this whole webinar is one series of side quests.
Yeah. We're just like four friends at a bar. Like, that's it,
Yeah. If only the world would adopt MITRE ATT&CK, we could stop drinking. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, so interestingly enough, something I've observed, by the way, like James, you already know this, right? I grew up in Virginia. I spent my whole entire life in and around the public sector in Virginia. Maybe I did some light contracting work, but every single person in Northern Virginia, some way, shape, or form, works for the public sector. What's interesting is that when you go around the world, the reason I say that is because when you go around to visit all these other countries, what I noticed is the public sector in a lot of countries outside of the States are actually the folks that are on the cutting edge of cybersecurity, and security engineering. And a lot of the private sector is always dependent on the public sector in all these other countries outside, more dependent on the public sector in countries outside of the States. Whereas in America, I think we've got to this place where we've got like a really nice, healthy balance between public and private sector contributions to advancing the state of security. Obviously, James, what I mentioned earlier about optimizing the alert process, this is something I mean broadly for the industry as a whole, because we also obviously provide intelligence research through TAG and through various other components of our business. And just something that people seem to forget, is the research, and then turning the research into something that's actionable for the teams is something that we all have to improve. And ATT&CK obviously is hopefully helping us get to a place where we're able to immediately take research and identify it to something that we can build to bolster our defenses internally. But in the respect of sort of countries outside of the States, it's been interesting because a lot of times the public sector provides the standards for the private sector. And even here, I mean, right, Biden's latest, cybersecurity mandates, or not mandates, but recommendations, all of the things that CISA puts out, all of the standards that we've got, the frameworks, NIST frameworks, everything, super, super, super powerful. And so, when I go back to the ISO example, ISO is the International Organization of Standards, right? And the key thing is international, right? And so if we think about MITRE ATT&CK is an international framework. It's not something that's just applicable to the American market. It is international. And so the more folks that do come together to help drive the state of attack, and also bring in that regionality, the context of regionality, because, one thing that I know Mandian sees, on the ground is the types of adversaries that are, attacking certain countries in the Middle East are probably very different than, the types of adversary TTPs that are affecting financial services customers in Northeast USA. So it's just my 2 cents of the space outside of America.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot that's really interesting here, right? I mean, I think actually a lot of tactics are repeated. So lateral movement, if you're running some of the key TTPs that we see over and over, it can help you across sectors. I think that's important to point out. But let's take the invasion of Ukraine as an example of how and why I was so comforted that attack existed, right, during the invasion in a way, because we could tell the world and be like, these are the tactics and techniques that we've seen the Russian government use in the past. So if you want to put your shields up right now, for CISA's language, say this is a shields up campaign, you can actually get ready for we know the TTPs that the Russians have employed over and over. And I mean, there's a lot to talk about, obviously, regarding the war, and there's a lot to talk about in the cyber aspects of it. But one of the things that I think was a helpful accelerant of our communications around the war was using attack to say this is what we can anticipate the Russian government doing. And I think from an allies and partners standpoint, if we're preparing for other potential contingencies, particularly with China, then we can highlight some China-based TTPs with our allies and partners. And I'm not surprised that Australia has adopted attack either. But that's a helpful point to think about potential alliance cooperation going down the line. James, could you tell us about some of the cool research you've been doing at CISA to put attack into practice, and how and why you think this is helpful for the world? Just tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've been doing, we obviously track the adversary relatively closely, and we do a lot of reports based on real-time operational activity. But one of the most exciting and interesting projects that I was a part of was we recently released a report based on our findings from our CISA Red Team. And
Mm-hmm.
that was one of the more inspiring and exciting things that we've done at this agency with the blessing of our director and everyone involved, where we were able to take the findings of the full attack lifecycle. This was a team that is CISA personnel. It's the good guys emulating the adversary. And so we had all of the details. There was no blind spots. There was no missing pieces. We had the full attack lifecycle, and we were able to write the whole report. We were able to map it to attack to really help our readers. And we were able to show that even at a very mature organization, there are gaps and there are places where everyone can improve. And based on this attack mapping, there's a lot that you can do as an organization, even if you think you are the cream of the crop, even if you think you are mature, if you have your own red teams, if you have all these defenses in place and all very expensive technology in those pieces. I think it really highlights the need to continually test your defenses and improve upon your posture.
That's awesome. And for those watching, we'll put on the day of the event, we'll put it in the description for the event, so you can click on the link. James, thanks for telling us about it. What are some lessons that you would tell the community for adopting MITRE ATT&CK coming out of it? Is there anything in particular, like a particular finding from the report, that you might want to surface?
I think one of the biggest things is just because a threat actor gets into the network doesn't mean they're successful. And I think you see that in the report is our red team did have quite a bit of success, but a lot of what they did was blocked by implementing simple things like two-factor authentication, really basic stuff, cyber hygiene practices that a lot of organizations, no matter how mature you are, just aren't doing. And again, mapping all of this back to attack gives them that simple framework where they can see as they're testing that they're missing A, B, and C, and they can implement quickly instead of just wondering and doing long asset inventories or just chasing around indicators, where they can quickly action the major gaps and at least limit the impact of the compromise.
That's awesome. Great.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff.
Iman, you had a question earlier.
I think ever since we all met, I've been tracking both, actually all three of you, all of your work, and it's actually been really fascinating just sort of getting together and talking through a lot of this stuff live. Actually, Madeline, I'm kind of curious, like, given your role, and obviously you've been in this industry for so long, what is the one way in which you think, let's just say our goal is to help people truly build a proactive security capability? Like, what is the one biggest thing that people can do coming out of this, this webinar, to really help drive to a more proactive security capability?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And given that we're focused on attack here, I would say one takeaway for anyone watching this session, whether you're in threat intelligence or a consumer of it, or just someone protecting your own network, if you are engaging with the attack framework and are finding gaps in it, I would really encourage you to participate in the community to feed that back and help grow the framework. It's very community led. It's useful having more voices in the room who have examples of procedure examples. Those are things that are invaluable when defining a new attack technique. So yeah, just feed that back to the community and help those of us who already love the framework grow it to make it better for everyone.
That's a great point. I think the Center for Threat Informed Defense, with the mappings project and the sightings project in particular, allows people to contribute, and that's one of the transformative aspects about the center. And that's what ultimately brought me to Iman and Madeline, at least initially, was the center's research. So we want to give the center a big plug. I know the center has been a huge part of Purple Hats. There's a lot of good content around what the center has done, but you can click on the sightings project, which will be at the link below, if you have reporting to contribute around threats that you see in the world. This is what strengthens the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Here's a question for James, actually, about attack. How much does the intelligence community contribute to attack right now? Is intelligence diluted and put through a declassification process, and it ends up in attack, or is that not happening so much these days?
I think it could definitely be more automated. It's a relatively manual process right now, but I would think, the information that is declassified is handed to the correct personnel to then map it to attack. So I don't think there's major issues or major
Mm-hmm.
hurdles as far as that goes. But again, just like our alert system and writing these cybersecurity advisories, automation is always the key and the next level that we're looking towards.
Yeah. So in other words, you want Chat GPT to write your alerts for you so that you can go and live on a beach. And my question was a little bit less about the sort of automated transfer, but how much of the MITRE ATT&CK framework contains any of the special sauce knowledge that the intelligence community has about the adversary that's then been declassified versus Google or Microsoft, who may discover something on their own platforms, or another private individual can report it into the attack framework.
That's a tough question. As I understand it, and I don't know the full scope of this, but a lot of this really isn't as secret as we might think. A lot of the intel community, what they're doing is heavily based on what private industry is feeding. And maybe it goes through a certain process where it then is classified based on findings. So a
Mm-hmm.
lot of this is kind of a back and forth, and it's really just showing the unified community, both private and government. And so, whether or not it's based on attack to start or to finish, we're always trying to get there.
Yeah. I remember that there were parts of it initially. I mean, certainly a lot of the understanding of the adversary initially, when I first started in cybersecurity 13 years ago, was classified. And that the one of the transformative aspects of it was this was the first unclassified manner that we could talk about the adversary. Like when I remember a nation state broke into a major financial institution in 2010, and the financial institution couldn't talk about it because of fears of its own victimhood, the problems it had about disclosure. Um, and there was no easy way to talk about it internally. So my suspicion is that the intelligence community uses MITRE ATT&CK quite a bit when they're analyzing adversary behavior. But it's an interesting question, and maybe this isn't the right group of people to sort of drill into what the intelligence community has that's above and beyond attack from understanding adversary behavior. So I think that's something perhaps to ask the attack people themselves.
Yeah, but I
But
mean,
this is, yeah. Go
don't
ahead.
you think that like generally, let's take attack out the equation. The goal of gaining intelligence wherever you are is largely the same, right? Like if I just made up a little framework in my head, right? Like research, identify the adversary, uh, observe, document, and disseminate, right? Like that largely, whether it's documented and disseminated through things like attack and these comprehensive reports and using tools to drive better automation, but like largely at the end of the day, the goal is to get an eye. I mean, even just go back to I keep going back to this. Go back to Lord of the Rings. Go back to any of these, like just sort of, war before the days, or even just take physical security. Like I take everything and I say, let me apply cybersecurity. And let me just imagine that we're in a bank, right? And what's super important, like let's just say someone, you watch these movies, The National Treasure or whatever those movies are, and there's always the robber always has some interesting the successful robbers always have some interesting technique that the bank doesn't have the instrumentation to detect, to identify, and to respond to, right? And so whether it's like some special laser device that they use to break through these walls and they preach to blah, 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 whatever it may be. My point is, at the end of the day, whether it's physical security, whether it's cybersecurity, the goal of intelligence is to truly understand who they are, what they're doing, how they're doing it, and being able to disseminate that knowledge to the relevant stakeholders. So whether that's through attack, right, which is obviously makes it a lot easier because it's an organized framework for me to digest and understand, or whether it's even just through publishing, PDF reports that hopefully get targeted to the right people. And now we have to figure out how to interpret that with our defenses. Either way, it's relevant. It's just a matter of making it easier for people to consume.
I think on your imaginary new framework of like research at one end and dissemination on the other, I think one thing that Attack is interesting and like well positioned to do is it's useful when you're receiving knowledge and disseminating knowledge. So like on both ends of that processing, you can use the same framework in the same language.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll add on to that is just, we keep going back to indicators and TTPs and one versus the other. And I think, tacking on to Iman, what you were saying is, Attack makes this available to everyone. So when we're talking about intel reporting, classified intel reporting, some of the unique indicators are, calling out specific, maybe impacted organizations, whether it's in a URL string or something like that. And it's next to impossible to share on a major scale, whereas you can call out the specific tactic, technique, sub-technique, whatever they were doing to get there, and that can be shared with everyone. So this is the way to share the information on what the adversary is doing without impacting victim organizations or impacting, classified intel operations.
Awesome. Well, this is like such a great conversation, and there's so many different ways that we could go and directions we could go and research projects we could go into and fund. We're probably going to have to call half of them Helms Deep, or some other. We can use the lexicon from Lord of the Rings to name all of our research projects. And James, I definitely want to have you on a podcast soon, just you to talk about the Red Team report. That's something that we definitely need to like plumb into and pull more strings on. That sounds really interesting. Madeline, thank you for joining. Thank you for your work. It's great to have you here. I want to find more ways to work with all of you outside of webinars. I think we should probably gin up some research projects for the Center for Threat Informed Defense. That probably involve how best to kill an insect. Isn't that right, Iman?
I hear a shoe.
Well, actually, yeah, I wanted to show you the proof. It's there. You can kind of see the outline. You see that? Crazy. What a life.
Yeah.
You're just running. That's a deception technique. You can convince us of anything. Thank you very much, Iman, for joining. It's such a pleasure having you around. And thank you everyone for tuning in to today's conversation. We hope you enjoyed it half as much as we did, at least.
Always a fun time. Great seeing everyone.
Yeah.
See ya.
Thanks for having us.